Okay, so I guess we might as well get started. Is everybody here? Who's not here? Raise your hand. All right, cool. We're going to take a look today at sharpening. Do we need to sharpen all images? You don't have to sharpen everything. I come from the days of film. I think I might have mentioned earlier that I'm old, like really old. And when I was here, it was all film-based. Sharpening was a difficult task. There wasn't a sharpen filter. There was a technique referred to as making an Unsharp Mask. We'll talk about that later on, but it was a pain in the butt. So for the most part, we didn't. We just made sure everything was in focus. So sharpening is kind of the last step before you send it off to the printer, sending it to a magazine or whatever. But there's other stages of sharpening as well. The prepping it for output is referred to as output sharpening, but there's also input sharpening. When an image first comes into a computer, it's always going to be a little bit soft. If you scan some film or you scan a negative or a print, it'll be a little bit soft. Usually you'll do a little bit of sharpening just before you even start doing any retouching on it, just to make sure that it's at an acceptable level of sharpness. If it comes out of a digital camera, it'll need some kind of sharpening. Now, for the most part, you guys don't need to worry about input sharpening because the camera takes care of it for you if you're shooting JPEG. If you shoot JPEG, it will actually apply a bit of sharpening before it saves the file to the card. And if you're shooting RAW, you might have noticed sometimes when you're processing out a RAW file, if I pop over to this section here, wait a minute, there's already numbers in there. There's some sharpening, and it's got an amount, a radius, some detail. Where did those numbers come from? I didn't put them in there. The camera didn't. That's Adobe. When a new camera comes out, Adobe gets a bunch of samples of it, and they do a bunch of testing to see how it handles color and noise and all that kind of stuff. And it decides how much sharpening that camera is going to need. Why would a camera need sharpening? Like maybe you spent a whole lot of money on like a really high resolution body, and you spent a lot of money on like a really sharp lens. Why might you need to sharpen something when it comes right out of your camera? What are some factors in your camera that are working against you getting a sharp image? We talked a little bit about one. Let's say you had a 20 megapixel camera. You've got 20 million pixels. Inside your camera, if you were to actually take a look at your sensor, you would see something kind of like this. Yeah, it might give you a bit of a headache there. But this is the Bayer pattern. So every single pixel on top of your sensor has a color filter on top of it, either a red filter, a green filter, or a blue filter. So let's say you were taking a picture of a rose. You've got all the white light falling onto the rose and the leaves and all that stuff in the scene. And the rose will absorb a bunch of the colors, but it'll reflect that red back. The red will fly through your lens, smack into your sensor, and let's say it hits this pixel right here. Well, a red filter will let that red light pass right through, so that pixel will generate good electric charge. And oh, I saw a lot of stuff. But then that red light that hits a green pixel, well, the green filter is going to block that light from going through. So the pixel behind that filter will go, I didn't see very much stuff at all. And the blue pixels will probably get even less because it's really going to block a lot of that light. Let's say this red pixel here, the red light comes through and it shines and hey, the red says, I saw a lot of information. But you need full color information. You need red, green, and blue for a pixel, right? You need RGB values. So where is this pixel going to get its green and blue information from? Well, it's going to have to look at the neighboring pixels. So for the green, it'll go, well, these green pixels saw this much light, so we'll average it out and we'll stick it into there. These blue pixels saw this much light, so we'll average it out and we'll stick it into there. And there's our green and blue values. So really, fully 2/3 of the values in your images are just kind of guessed from neighboring pixels, just kind of interpolated up. So there's a little bit of softness that comes from that. For now, this is what we're stuck with, the Bayer pattern. So that adds a little bit of softness to your images. And there's something else in your camera that's adding a bit of softness to your image. This you can't do anything about, but this other thing is put in there deliberately. Anybody know what it is that I'm talking about? The anti-aliasing filter. You ever heard of that? The AA filter? Why would they deliberately blur your images, do you think? A filter right in front of your sensor that blurs the image. What would be the advantage of that? Say you're photographing something for a real estate agent, and there's a cottage, and they have a screen door on the front of a cottage. And a screen door, if you think about it, is a grid, kind of vertical columns and horizontal rows of squares. And your sensor is also a grid of squares, isn't it? Vertical and horizontal rows and columns of squares. What would happen if you're photographing that cottage and the image of the screen door gets projected onto your sensor at about the same size as the grid pattern of your sensor? So the grid pattern of the screen is about the same size as the grid pattern on your sensor. What can happen? It starts with an M, Morei patterns. You ever heard of Morei? Well, let's take a look at this here. I've got two layers here. I've got a row of vertical columns and a bunch of lines at the top there, and they're overlapping. And if I were to move one of them ever so slightly relative to the other, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, where did that dark band in the middle come from? Well, if I zoom in there, when these things are lined up with each other, everything's nice and bright. But if I move them a little bit, let's say I just keep moving this bottom row to the left there, every now and then we get this dimming effect. Now that's if they're exactly the same size. In theory, they can totally hide right behind each other. But what if I made them just slightly smaller? What if I scaled it down a little bit? Suddenly all these weird patterns start to emerge. Or what if it rotates ever so slightly? You can get these effects where patterns appear in the image that weren't actually there. Here's an example of a window scene, and if you look at this window there, if I zoom in a little bit, we can see every single square in that screen. But if I start shrinking this down, eventually the size of the squares in the image will start to conflict with the size of the squares on the screen. You can see those patterns that are starting to appear in there at certain sizes, and at different scales they'll start to disappear. Now we'll talk more about Morei in other classes, but this is what that anti-aliasing filter is on there to help avoid. So the idea behind the anti-aliasing filter is to prevent Morei. The effect of the anti-aliasing filter is to blur your images slightly. So that's why that input sharpening is necessary, either right off the bat from the camera itself. If you're shooting JPEG, you can't switch that off, or in camera raw, those values were put in there by Adobe to make sure the images are appropriately sharp. That kind of sucks. Let's take a look at the Unsharp Mask. That's like the workhorse of the industry. So we'll start with that. Okay, so I've got a file here, and we've got some high contrast edges over here. We've got some area where the light side of the edge is really light and the dark side of the edge is really dark. And then we have some very low contrast edges where the light side of the edge is barely distinguishable from the dark side of the edge. And in fact, right up the middle, there's actually a row of pixels that are the exact same brightness. So what does a Unsharp Mask filter do to your image? Well, first off, let's just quickly talk about what that name comes from, because it sounds kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Unsharp Mask. If you're trying to make it sharper, why would you use something that starts with unsharp? Like I said, it goes back to the days of the darkroom, where if you had an image that was slightly soft and you wanted to give it a little bit of extra crispiness, you would take the negative, and you guys remember there was like an enlarger and it would project the image down onto the table. You would take the negative, not in the enlarger, but you would actually put it under the enlarger. But first, you would take a piece of unexposed film, you'd set it down on the table of the enlarger, then you'd put a piece of glass over top of that, and then you would put the negative on top of the piece of glass and just project light right through the negative onto the piece of film down below. So when you processed that film, you ended up with a negative of your negative, basically a positive version of the negative, but it was slightly out of focus. Because there's the spacing of that glass in there, it was slightly unsharp. And when you put that over top of your negative and looked through it, it masked off your negative, and you could see kind of the contrasting edges of the image. And by printing through both of those sandwiched together, you ended up with an image that appeared to be a little bit sharper. Basically, it found the edges in the image and enhanced the contrast of those edges. Now, it didn't introduce any new information, just like the Unsharp Mask filter isn't going to introduce any new information. If you took a photograph of the front page of the newspaper and it's not quite sharp enough to read, the filter isn't going to somehow figure out what the day's headlines were and what happened in the news and put that information in there for you. If it's not there, you're not going to be getting it back. But what it will do is accentuate the edges, make your eye kind of get drawn toward and go, hey, there's an edge there where it might not have been as obvious before. So it gives the impression of it being a little bit sharper. But if your image is out of focus, it's out of focus. You're not going to make it in focus. It's not like on TV when they have like security camera footage and they'll be like, hey, those 3 pixels in the corner, zoom in, expand, enhance, and then suddenly you see like stubble on the guy's face. It doesn't work that way. It can only work with what it has. But let's just take a look at that Unsharp Mask filter and those sliders and see what exactly it is that they're doing. So I'm going to go under Filter, Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask. Let's take a look here. We have an amount, a radius, and a threshold. Now I'm going to pull this up so you can see exactly what's going on here. Let's talk about these sliders. The amount slider, what do you think that controls? Remember, it's just adding contrast to the edges. What do you think the amount slider controls? The amount of contrast that it adds to the edges. Yes, it's very direct. It says amount. Okay, if we do less, there is a lower amount of contrast. There's before, there's after. You can still see that the light side of the edge is getting a bit lighter. The dark side is getting a bit darker, but not nearly as much. If I crank it, the light side gets really light, and the dark side gets really dark. Cool. And as we get into the lower contrasts, here there's almost no difference between, this is the light side here, this is the dark side here. I actually had to check because I can't even tell it myself, but it saw the difference and it said, oh, there's an edge there. Let's add some contrast to it. Cool. So the amount, how much contrast, the amount of contrast that gets added. What about radius? What do you think that controls? How far on either side of the edge that contrast gets added? Like you can imagine if there was a little black speck here, you would expect to see, say, a little white ring around it, a little white circle with a radius of 1.1 pixels. Now, you might be looking at this and going, well, that is way more than 1.1 pixels. Yes, it's kind of a gradient with a midpoint of around 1.1 pixels out from the edge. So the light side gets lightened, the dark side gets darkened, and the midpoint of that gradient is about 1.1 pixels out. If we make it smaller, you get a tighter, more defined sharpening effect or contrast line. If I make it wider, well, it can get, well, really nasty down there. All right, threshold. That one's a little bit tougher, isn't it? What do you think the threshold slider controls? Well, let's take a look at what's going on here. Remember I said there's like a band down the middle where it's like the exact same shade of gray, so there's no contrast getting applied. Here, the difference is, I can't even, if I just look at this here without seeing what's over here, I couldn't tell you which one's lighter and which darker, but it was able to see that edge. It said, oh, there's a little bit of difference between the light side and the dark side. Let's add some contrast. Watch what happens if I bring that threshold up a little bit. Here we are at 38 levels of threshold. Basically, this means that there has to be at least 38 levels of difference between the light side and the dark side before the filter decides that it is in fact an edge and adds that contrast to it. So here it said, nope, not enough difference. Nope, not enough difference. Oh, here, aha, there's at least 38 levels from that 0 to 255 grayscale range. So it said, oh, here's where the contrasting edge is. If there's a difference of 38 levels, it's an edge. Let's add some contrast. So it said, yep, we'll add the contrast there. If I bring the threshold up higher, it gets a little more specific about what it's going to sharpen. It says, oh, now you have to have at least 84 levels between the light side and the dark side, and you don't get any sharpening until you reach there. Now, this kind of has a weird effect. Like, we've got an entire area in the center here where there's no contrast being applied. There's no sharpening. I got to do this because it's not actually sharpening the image. But there's no contrast being applied. And that raises kind of an interesting question. Why would you not want to sharpen part of your image? There's an example where you might not want to sharpen part of an image. The lower contrast areas. What if you're doing a fashion shoot? Do models have perfectly smooth skin with no fine lines and no wrinkles? No, they're human. They probably have better skin than most of us. But if you were to zoom right in there and see the texture of the skin, let's say it's a very flat light, maybe like a ring light or something coming right from the front, there won't be a lot of texture. Like the difference between the brightest and the darkest parts of that texture might only be like 8 or 9 levels. But if you've got it set to 0, it's going to see that texture in the skin and it's going to exaggerate it. You'll see that sharpening, that extra contrast of the skin, the pores, the fine lines, the wrinkles are going to stand out even more. Would that make the model happy or sad? Well, that's a good point, yeah. On average, I think we would go with sad there. Now, 8 or 9 levels of difference between the shadows and the highlights, the peaks and ridges of the texture there. So if you were to set that threshold to 10 or 15, suddenly it looks at this texture on the skin, 8 or 9 levels, and says, nope, not enough difference, not going to sharpen it. Leaves it as is. But the eyes, the hair, the jewelry, all the stuff that you want to have that crispy kind of, hey, look at that, notice it, feel, gets that contrast applied to it. Or maybe you're photographing a landscape image and you've got some trees, all that nice sharp foliage, the bark texture on the trunk, the gravel pathway down below, and this beautiful blue sky up above. When you're standing out there looking at it, is there texture in that beautiful blue sky? No, it's just a nice smooth blue, isn't it? But is there texture in a digital photograph of a beautiful blue sky? Yeah, there's going to be a little bit of noise in there. It doesn't matter how low your ISO is, there's going to be some noise in that sky. It might only be 1 or 2 levels of difference, but at a threshold of 0, that filter's going to see it. You bring that threshold up to 4, 5, 6, the noise in the sky is below the threshold of the filter. It gets left alone, but the trees, the bark, the gravel, all of that gets that nice crispy sharpness that you were looking for. If you leave that down and you really overdo it, you might start noticing this kind of like, almost like a crackly orange peel sort of texture happening in the sky. All All right. So 3 sliders, now we know what they do. Let's play around with them. Now in this photograph, the camera that took the picture was focused on the guy, the camcorder, and that wall is fairly far off in the distance. Like you're getting a shadow because of the flash on the camera there, but there's quite a distance between the camcorder and the guy in the background. And that wallpaper actually has a very detailed pattern on it, but it's well outside the depth of field, so it's out of focus. So you would expect that there wouldn't be any texture in there, right? You can get a sense of the pattern that was on the wallpaper, but there shouldn't be any texture. And yet, if we zoom in on it, what do we see? We see some light pixels. We see some dark pixels. Wait a minute, we see texture. Why would we see texture in that wall that's out of focus? It's that noise that we were talking about earlier. I'm not sure what the ISO was on this image, but look at this. Some of these pixels are quite a bit brighter than other pixels, and some of the pixels are quite a bit darker. What causes noise in an image? When your camera takes a photograph, like we said, light pours onto the sensor just like it's a solar panel, and it builds an electric charge, but there's also a little bit of randomness in there, and that's what you're seeing in this image. This one was reading a little bit too low, this one was reading a little bit too high, and you'll see some color variations as well. If it was a red one that was reading too high, it's going to throw off the red values in the pixels around it. If it was a green one that was reading too low, it'll throw off the green values in the pixels around it. If we were to sharpen this image, so I just went under Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And if I crank the threshold, 500%, there we go. Holy mackerel, there's before and there's after. Like I said, in that sky, you might start noticing that kind of like, crackly orange peel sort of texture happening. Well, there it is. But we have our threshold slider. You'll notice there's a lot of high contrast edges on the camcorder. There's a lot of high contrast edges on the eye, the hair, the pinstripes on the jacket there. Not a lot of high contrast edges in here. If I start bringing this threshold up a little bit at a time, eventually the sharpening gets removed from the background. Now, we still get it on, if I turn this preview off and on, we still get it on the camcorder. I've pushed this way beyond anything that you could consider reasonable, just so you can see the effect going on up here. But still, the pinstripes on his suit, the camcorder, the hair, it's still getting that effect. And you can see the same kind of deal happening on his skin. If I zoom in here on his face, here's before, here's after. Orange peel texture, probably not going to be too pleased with that. But if you start easing that threshold up, you can see it eases out of the skin. But again, we still get it in the hair, the camcorder, the pinstripes. So that's the idea behind these sliders here. The threshold is to ease it off of those areas that are supposed to be smoother, those lower contrast areas where you don't want that texture to be exaggerated. Now, a lot of people say, well, what numbers do you start with for sharpening? Like, what do you throw in there just to start? There's really no answer for that. There's a lot of factors that can affect the type or the amount of sharpening that you would apply to an image. Probably the 3 main ones would be image content. Like you would sharpen a portrait very differently than you would sharpen a landscape, which you would sharpen very differently than a bottle of shampoo for the Metro catalog. Personal preference also has a lot to do with it. I mentioned I'm ludicrously old, and when I was here, it was all film-based, and to sharpen something involved a lot of work in the darkroom, and it was nasty. So a lot of people just didn't sharpen. It wasn't like a filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, and there we sharpened it. It was a big process. So things mostly just didn't get sharpened. Just make sure you focus in your camera, use a low ISO, use a nice sharp lens. So you might find that older people, they prefer what's known as the filmic quality, kind of a little bit softer, a little bit lower saturation. As digital came around, people wanted that really crisp sort of look. Look, I've got the highest megapixel camera. Look, I've got the most expensive lens, and they really started sharpening the heck out of everything. So some people really like that crispy, sharp sort of look. Some people like that softer, more filmic quality. So this person might look at that guy's work and go, wow, that is way over sharpened. And this guy would look at that guy's work and go, wow, that is really soft looking. So personal preference has a lot to do with it as well. But probably the biggest factor is resolution. The resolution of the image can have a lot to do with the type or amount of sharpening that you would apply to the image. So let's play around with that. What you see on the screen will give you an idea of what might come out of the printer, but it's not necessarily going to be a one-for-one exact match. But with the screens that you guys have, I'm guessing most of you guys have the Retina displays or some kind of Windows equivalent, high DPI. Probably set it around size as. So if you're trying to make like an 8x10, look at it around 8x10. If you're doing something smaller, make it smaller. And just kind of visually play around with it. Get a feel for what you think looks good. And just for the sake of rememberability, for mine I've got an amount of 200, a radius of 2, a threshold of 20. It's easy to remember. You guys will have something different. But I want to take a look at the effective resolution on this. So let's pretend, once you got those values in there, that this is the version for the client. And hit OK so it actually applies that filter. The Unsharp Mask filter is what we call sticky, so it will remember those settings the next time we call it up. So I'm going to hit OK here, and that applies the contrast. And if I was doing this job for the client and he told me he wants a full res and a low res, I'd probably save this up, call it, whatever, high res. But to make a smaller version and then sharpen that, I'd probably go back to the original unsharpened version of it. In theory, scaling it down would probably scale a lot of that sharpening out. But just to make sure we're going from the same starting point, let's undo that sharpen, or let's go under File, Revert. And let's scale this image down. So the client has said they want the full res that they can use for, magazines, promotional, printing, whatever. But they also want a low res version that they can use for social media. They want it to be 600 pixels on the longest side at 72 pixels per inch. And let's take a look at scaling this thing down here. So I'm going to go under Image, Image Size, and they want it 600 pixels on the longest side, which for this image, it's a horizontal, so that would be the width. Here's an interesting question. If you have to change both the resolution and the pixel dimensions, which value should you type in first? I'd go with the resolution. I'll show you why in a second. First off, you need to make sure your resample is turned on so you can actually scale it down. Make sure that the width and the height are locked, that your aspect ratio is constrained. Make sure this little chain link icon is in here. And if you have to change both the resolution and the pixel dimensions, set the resolution first, and I will show you why. Let's say I was going to resize this to 600 pixels on the long side, and I said, I'm going to do the pixels, then the resolution, and then I will hit OK. So I take the pixels, width 600, and then I go to the resolution. Right now it's 240. If I put in 72 and hit OK, what size does this get scaled down to? 180 pixels wide. When you change the resolution, it will also change the pixel dimensions. So when you're changing both, put the resolution in first. So make sure this is at pixels. Set the resolution, in this case, to 72. And you'll notice it started out at 3,504 pixels wide. When I put the 72 in, now it's only 1,051. Doesn't matter because I'm going in to change this anyway. 600 pixels on the long side at 72 pixels per inch, and hit OK. Now, if you zoom in to the same size, you'll notice that it is significantly, not necessarily softer, but it will be quite pixelated because, it's only 600 pixels wide now. It was originally 3,500. But if it's this low resolution, you're not going to be looking at it this close anyway. This is for PowerPoint or a website or something where it would probably be about maybe that size on the screen. The sharpen filter is sticky, so it remembers what I put in last. The image content hasn't changed. It's the same photo. My personal preferences haven't changed, at least not much in the last 2.5 minutes. So really, the sharpening that worked before should work, right? So let's go under Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And it's sticky, so it remembers the sharpening. Holy mackerel. What's going on here? My personal preferences haven't changed. The image content hasn't changed. And yet, look at what's happening. Halos. Visible halos are like a dead giveaway for over-sharpening. So clearly this is being over-sharpened, but it worked so well before. What's changed in this image? The number of pixels. It used to be 3,500 pixels wide. Now it's only 600 pixels wide. So 2 pixels, when it's 3,500 pixels wide, is like 1/1750th of the overall width of the image. Just a tiny little fraction of it there. So just a nice, tight, precise halo. Now that it's down to 600 pixels, that same 2-pixel radius is now only 1/300th of the overall width. So it's a significantly larger portion of the overall image. Plus, if we had sent this to a magazine to be printed when it was full size, we probably would have sent it at, say, 300 pixels per inch, right? And at 300 pixels per inch, that 2 pixels would be 1/150th of an inch wide. Just a tiny little razor sharp sharpening crispiness that's being added. Now that it's only 72 pixels per inch, that same 2-pixel radius is a 36th of an inch, a much larger thing around the outside. And sure enough, we can see that radius, that 36th of an inch. Now here's something interesting. The background is kind of a brownish beigey back here. it's got a light band here and a dark band here, but it's the same background. Why would the lightness of the band change? Why would the halo color change for the same background? Remember, it's looking for edges and it's adding contrast. So between the camcorder and the background, the camcorder is the dark edge, the background is the light edge. The dark side gets darkened, the light side gets lightened. But between the nose and the background is the dark edge. So the dark side gets darkened, the light side gets lightened. Interesting, but still too much. So the radius is clearly too large. Let's take that down a little bit. And for something at such a low resolution, something fairly small, maybe even like a half a pixel might be appropriate. And I'm going to zoom out to kind of a normal viewing size here. I think that half a pixel is probably a little bit better. We may need to play around with the amount, but I'm noticing if I turn this preview off and on that almost nothing is happening. Oh, the threshold slider. Remember the threshold slider? We'd put the threshold on there to fight the noise in the background, and because those pores in his skin were really starting to stand out. Although, now that we've scaled it down, when it was full resolution, noise, if you think about it, by definition is 1 pixel in size. It's a pixel that's reading too bright or too dark. It can affect the color around it, but the brightness is specific to that 1 pixel. And having taken it from 3,500 pixels down to only 600, it's down to like less than a fifth of its overall original width. So that 1 pixel wide noise is down to like less than 0.2 pixels. We've basically scaled the noise right out of the image. And the same thing for the texture on his skin. It might have been 2 or 3 pixels wide, each pore, each little bit of stubble and stuff, but having scaled it down to less than 1/5 of its original width, those pores have also basically been scaled out of the image. So if I were to take that threshold down, yeah, that kind of brings in a little bit of that extra crispiness around the image there. And there's a before and there's an after. So the resolution has a lot to do with the amount of sharpening that you would apply to an image. When it looks good, we'll hit OK. And that was something else that we could save up and send off to the client. So that's the Unsharp Mask filter. Looks for contrasting edges and it adds contrast to those edges.